Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining our March webinar. We're going to go ahead and get started promptly as promised because we have a great set of guest speakers today and a super important and timely topic. My name is Dave Hodgins. I'll be hosting today. And as I mentioned, I'm joined by some all-star guest speakers today, talking about science-based targets, climate risk assessments, and all of this almost seems like a perfect coincidence with Monday's release of the SEC proposed guidelines for public companies on reporting climate risk, and really building on the conversation we had last month with the mayor's office and leadership from the Urban Land Institute on development of LA's own building performance standard and decarbonization policy for buildings. As always, want to thank our funders and sponsors, LA Department of Water and Power, for ongoing support of this program. Their leadership, which you will hear about today, has really been exemplary in this area and long running. But as always, thank them. A little housekeeping before we get started. We will keep the attendee lines muted just to keep things orderly, but please do submit questions via the chat function should be on the right-hand side of the screen, I believe. We will try to save some time for Q&A at the end, so please do send your questions in. As always, we will send the slides, the recording, and we'll be dropping a bunch of great resources as well through the chat as we go, but also compiled along with the key takeaways on Friday. And as always, we appreciate your feedback. So very basic agenda. I'm going to provide some context and then really get it over as quickly as I can to our speakers. And we'll have a free-flowing discussion and hopefully some time for Q&A at the end. So diving right in, the need for action is clear. Right? This is all over the news now. I don't think it's just in my little echo chamber or news bubble, whatever you want to call it, based on my personal algorithm. Climate change is here. And the need for action is clear. I don't need to state that again, but I will. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, used to not publish reports so frequently. They keep pumping them out these days because the data are just shocking. I read yesterday that there's a new record at both the North and South Poles right now, where the North Pole is 70 degrees warmer than it should be right now. And the South Pole is 50 degrees warmer than it should be right now. So no joking here, even though it feels still relatively nice outside. LA is big and people are feeling the heat, and let's not forget the fires that we experienced not so long ago. So as I mentioned, we had planned this webinar in advance, as we do, but it just so happened that on Monday, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, released some proposed, they're proposed for public comment, but there was a 3-to-1 vote in favor of pushing these forward, some rules for public companies to basically talk about how their operations and future profitability, as well as supply chain for certain types of companies, are affected by what's going on. And to also disclose plans to address and manage those risks, and putting in place some standards to help basically guide investor decisions, whether those are retail or institutional investors, decisions about what companies to invest in. Right? A lot of our LABBC partners are public companies, and this is all the big names you can imagine. We'll get into some of the nuance and thoughts about this later in the conversation, I'm sure. But the SEC's understanding in my reading of their direct proposed rules is pretty sophisticated and nuanced, which I was encouraged to see. But this is directly getting into the financial markets piece of this. So this has also been a trend, though, on the legislative side, both at the state and local level, nationally. And this is a graph courtesy of our friends at the Institute for Market Transformation that shows cities that have benchmarking ordinances like we have here in LA, or policies that go beyond that. and more cities are passing building performance standards. LA, as we discussed last month, has kicked off a stakeholder engagement process. New buildings are first, but existing is under discussion now. And we really encourage all of you coming out of this webinar to hopefully take some of this home and really use this as a launching board to get engaged in that process. So as I mentioned, LA has begun a process here. That is a link where it says register for updates, where you can send an email to the mayor's office to be included on future communications about how to plug into that. And that link will be active in the slides that we will send through. And I think we can probably drop it in the chat. You will have an opportunity to jump in there. Before the holidays, City Council introduced a motion to set the stage, laid out some values, some core values that would underpin this whole process. A big part of that was around equity and accessibility, so that we don't have smaller, less well-resourced buildings sort of left with an unfunded mandate without the resources to get there. In February, so just last month, which was quick on the heels of the December motion, there was a motion to require that all new buildings must be net zero carbon from operations by 2030 or sooner. And as I mentioned, and on last month's webinar, we talked about kickoff of the process around existing buildings. And so this webinar builds on that discussion, and we'll be hearing some of the best practices, high road practices from some of our leading partners that are way ahead on this. And this has always been a part of, the DNA, right, in LA. And we'll talk a lot about the leadership from the private sector here, but certainly, Mayor Garcetti and before him, Mayor Villaraigosa have had climate and resilience and equity as central core values, really a lens, through which they've made a number of significant investments, and LADWP, of course, a huge force for good in that area. We'll be hearing more about that. But just one thing I would point out on this slide relative to today's conversation is that LA spans over 3 climate zones, right? So it's interesting to think about. LA is obviously large, but to think about there's 3 separate climate zones when you think about the valley all the way to the west side and everything in between, and more than 1 million buildings. So the risks facing each of those buildings are common and yet distinct. And how should we be thinking about that? And how should that affect investment strategy? How should that affect our other strategies around how we manage these assets? The private sector has also been leading in this area, and LA has been the #1 Energy Star city, thanks to leadership from the private sector ever since EPA even started tracking this. And there was 1 year where we fell off behind Washington, DC, and that's just because I say they got all the GSA buildings there, so that's cheating. LABBC has grown now in our 10th or 11th year to be one of the largest leadership initiatives in the world, which I'm really proud of. It's a little strange saying that, it's true. And that's, again, thanks to the leadership of all of you who have signed on to these goals and are really the ones that are making it real. So it's really an honor to provide the platform to highlight your work. And LADWP, as I mentioned, huge investments that decarbonize not just the power and the water that they provide, but also their own operations. And it unlocks opportunities for decarbonization in buildings, in transportation, in industry. And so really an amazing asset and partnership with our municipally owned utility here, I think. GRESB is the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. Many of you are probably familiar with that, but it is growing rapidly. The participation there with over 5.7 trillion of assets, and 49 of PERE's top 100 fund managers are part of that. And that's growing year over year. We're seeing finally some coalescence around frameworks, and GRESB is really emerging as the framework for reporting on a global basis sustainability efforts. There's also a new module in there for infrastructure, which is very relevant for today's conversation. Very few utilities are yet part of that. And another opportunity there for leadership. We Mean Business Coalition is a group of large corporations that formed when former President Trump tried to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. The private sector said, no, we're in. And so we saw massive participation. This has continued and does continue. It's now an independent nonprofit. It's receiving doubled its funding last year, is my understanding. And Climate Action 100 Plus is a group of institutional investors who are also have been and remain committed, and it's a growing slice of investors that are participating in that and taking an active role. And that does not mean divestment. That means being active shareholders trying to change the game. So it's really exciting to see the private sector activity and leadership happening at the same time as we see the increase in activity on the legislative side, both local, state, and now federal. But this is what concerns me. This is what concerns me. What's real, right? Now that we have all of these companies jumping into the mix, the sort of proliferation of consultants and software providers that are trying to service this need, what's real? And there's a lot of greenwashing happening. I think, you know, we were doing well for a while when this was really just the real leaders, the ones who are truly bought in for the right reasons. We're not gaming the system, but now we're seeing this proliferation of quote ESG funds, and they're still investing in oil. They're still investing in all kinds of activities and businesses that are really not consistent with what environmental and social governance investment should be about. And that's because it's been self-reported. There's a lack of oversight and transparency. We're hearing a lot about reporting fatigue, right? There's so much reporting that's already required for a real estate investment company or any type of corporation, public companies especially. So adding yet another one, and it's everything all at once now, right? As these issues are becoming more and more apparent in our daily lives, in the news, how do we manage all of this? So even where there are best efforts being made, it's a lot to manage. And so how to do this effectively, how to do it accurately, and all of this is happening at once. The same is true on climate risk assessments, and we're going to talk about that today. You know, market-specific and asset-specific climate risk assessment, diverse tools and standards, everything all at once right now. And some of these are pretty black box types of platforms. And so how to choose which one to use, what's going to be acceptable as we get into some type of eventual SEC and other reporting at the city level as well. So how to make the right decisions. And of course, everything is happening very quickly. So enter science-based targets. Science-based targets is a global independent nonprofit that is helping corporations and other institutions, organizations to set real science-based targets to reduce emissions in line with Paris Climate Accord, or even more aggressively, should they so choose. And they provide that third-party review that is so important. So, you know, I talked about the sort of inherent issues around self-reporting. As GRES provides a framework for reporting of sustainability metrics on a global basis, so science-based targets starts to provide that third-party stamp of approval on plans to reduce those emissions, to actually move the needle through implementation of the types of projects that we all collaborate on through LABBC, through efficiency, resilience, and now more and more on fuel switching and decarbonization projects. I'm not going to go way in depth on what science-based targets are. I absolutely encourage all of you, and we'll be dropping links into the chat to find out more about how to get involved. They're somewhat flexible in terms of, you know, how to go about setting a target, what's included, what's not. As we see, the SEC guidance coming out just this Monday, decisions about that can change. And we're going to hear about that from some of our speakers later in the discussion today. But there's, several steps here. And this again provides that third-party review and a third-party stamp that helps to give confidence to investors and other stakeholders that plans and claims to become carbon neutral by some date certain are actually credible, right? That those actually hold water. I want to highlight some of our LABBC partners that are already part of this. And we'll be hearing from 3 of those today, which I'm very stoked that schedules worked out. And I really encourage everyone to look into this. This is a good exercise to go through to prepare for everything that's coming, both at local, state, and federal levels. And again, it's a flexible process, provides a framework, much like LEED helps to think about what does a green building mean. Science-based targets helps to think about what does a science-based credible approach to reduce our emissions by a date certain start to look like. And that's different for every company. We see diversity here in terms of property type and asset type, right? Multifamily versus commercial office and studios, very, very different in terms of the level of operational control. And then of course, LADWP, infrastructure assets, power plants, pumping stations, as well as administrative facilities, fleet operations, and so forth. So really want to acknowledge our LABBC partners that are already part of this and encourage everyone to get involved. This is a number one that is a little scary. That is not one that is fun to talk about, but FEMA actually ranks LA as the #1 riskiest county to be in, period. And they look at a number of risks, and these are mostly climate related, and with earthquakes being, I don't know if you call that climate, it's earth risk. We know we will have other massive earthquakes at any point soon. If anyone hasn't heard the podcast called The Big One, I encourage you to listen to that. It'll get you right out the door to restock your earthquake preparedness kit. We've experienced record heat. Lightning can set off fires. Wildfires can be sparked by a cigarette or a camping fire or a spark in a power line. So this is very real, and we shouldn't forget what we experienced just not long ago. The tornado is probably unlikely, but it's on the list there. So that being the case, and LA is not unique. Other markets present different climate, physical, and other risks. I like this definition of risk as the probability of the event occurring times the damage that would result. And there are methodologies for this in the insurance industry and so forth, but now this is being applied in this context in a different way. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done still with insurers around this. But what are the different types of risk? There's physical risk, there's infrastructure risk, which brings the public-private aspect into play here. How does all that impact resilience at the community level, as well as at the building level and local economic level? Transition risk talks about, and that relates really to policy risk, as we transition away from as much fossil fuels and hopefully to 100% clean energy. There's a transition that happens, and there's always friction and cost with transition. What does that look like in each market? And how do we begin to quantify that so we can say risk equals probability times damage and start to make investments accordingly? This is a great resource from our partners at the Urban Land Institute. And it's a little bit of an eye chart here, but this was from a report that they published a year or two ago, I think 18 months or so ago. They're always ahead of the game with their thought leadership about the current level of market understanding of these issues, and where, according to their survey, there's a strong understanding, an improving understanding, and really minimal understanding. And on the next slide, it speaks about the need for, as we've been talking about, better tools, better data, to help here. So market level risk assessment is a critical component of the investment and portfolio management decision-making process. Due diligence screens must incorporate the accelerating risks posed by climate change, fiscal policy constraints, and critical infrastructure investment, repair, and replacement. So real estate, the private sector can't do this on its own. There's a huge role for the utilities and the public sector to play as well. And that is what we are trying to facilitate here today, part of our job. And that is also a document. There is a screenshot of a document that I would encourage everyone to read. It's there on the ULI Knowledge Center, very easy to find, and we can provide that also as a follow-up. So with that, I will begin to transition over to the bulk of today's conversation. But really what we're advocating for is a holistic approach, right? One that is a high road approach that's not self-reported, that's leveraging best practices, third-party standards. So set a science-based target, benchmark and track your emissions in a more robust way. And a lot of you are already doing that, of course, through Energy Star for compliance with EBW, and potentially through other more robust tools beyond that. But assess those climate and related risks in a formalized way. Select a tool, select a methodology. This can be done internally, this can be done with a consultant, this can be done a multitude of ways, and we'll hear about how at least one of our partners has approached that today. And then focusing investments and collaboration with the public sector. I talked at the top about opportunity to engage in the policymaking process that is kicking off now, and that is so important. So I would encourage everybody to get involved, and of course, feel free to reach out to us to make those connections as well. So with that, let's get into our discussion today. Speaker introductions. Our first speaker is Nancy Sutley, Chief Sustainability Officer at LADWP. She's a huge leader in the space and has been very deep, worked also in the White House prior to that, and prior to that as a deputy mayor. So has a deep understanding of the role of the utilities and the public sector in this space. Really excited to hear from her. Also joined by Natalie Tier, Senior VP from Innovation, Sustainability, and Social Impact at Hudson Pacific. Huge leaders in the space, the largest owners, private owners of studio space, aside from the big four as well. So brings an interesting perspective there, and had a huge hand in the development of the original Sustainable City Plan prior to joining Hudson Pacific. And Becky Becker from Equity Residential, as the company name implies, residential, multifamily investor, owner, operator. And Becky is the Assistant VP in charge of environmental and climate adaptation. And she's got deep expertise and experience with climate risk assessments. So Nancy and Natalie will be talking mainly about science-based targets, Becky about climate risk assessment, and we'll all be discussing how all this interrelates. So with that, I'd like to first kick it over to Nancy, just to talk a little bit about science-based targets and LADWP's involvement in similar issues, in similar reporting frameworks up to now. But where did that desire to participate in that come from for DWP?
Well, thanks, Dave. And first of all, just a big thanks to LABBC for being such a great partner with LADWP and helping us help our customers achieve energy savings and saving money on their bills and helping us meet our climate goals. So, I think LA has embraced the notion of decarbonization in one way or the other over the last, couple of decades. And so, LADWP as a municipally owned utility, as a public agency here in Los Angeles, is really, we understand our role in helping our community meet its decarbonization goals, and that we not only have to talk the talk, we have to walk the walk. And so we've done this over a number of years. We were one of the original, I believe, organizations to report under California's climate registry back whatever, 15 or so years ago, maybe a little longer, and have participated in a number of these reporting platforms, Carbon Disclosure Project, or in the supply chain as well. And so it sort of made sense to us in terms of setting the science or participating in the science-based targets as really a way not only to hold ourselves accountable on not in how we are helping, besides sort of cleaning up the grid, how we are helping contribute to LA's march towards decarbonization. Like many of the other companies participating in LABBC and then on this webinar, you know, we're a big landowner. We have many thousands of buildings around Los Angeles. We own a lot of property in LA and in other parts of California and even out into other states. So our footprint, our environmental footprint, is something that we take seriously. So in our own operations, in our own buildings, in our own fleet, how can we show what we're able to do and how that can be translated into what other organizations, other companies here in Los Angeles can also do. So we're always looking to hold ourselves accountable, so that we're not just telling you what you should do, but that we're doing it ourselves.
Absolutely. Natalie, I wonder if you could just quickly introduce yourself and your work and give a basic rundown of the work that you're doing in this area as well.
Sure. So Hudson Pacific is a commercial office and studio REIT. We're a public company, about 20 million square feet from LA up to Vancouver. And now recently we just entered the London market. We're building a ground up studio there. Because of our geographic focus and the fact that most of our tenants are big creative media and tech companies, and we're a long-term vertically integrated operator, we're able to do things around sustainability and decarbonization that I think a lot of other traditional real estate owners are not able to. So we've invested heavily in a lot of energy retrofits and efficiency. We do benchmarking everywhere. We went net zero carbon neutral in all our operations in 2020. Now we're working towards a science-based target to reduce our emissions even further, 50% by 2030, which is aligned with a 1.5 degrees Paris scenario. And the intention that we've intentionally carved out offsetting instruments from that goal, because we want to be able to essentially wean ourselves off from those over time, which is why partnerships with LADWP and our other utilities are so important. So thanks, Dave, for convening this group.
Absolutely. And Becky, I wanted to give you a chance to introduce yourself and your work. I know you're focusing on the climate risk assessment component of this today, but from equity residential perspective.
Sure. No, thanks again, Dave, for including me in this conversation. It's great to be with these other women here. And just to talk about equity residential a little bit, we are a multifamily REIT with a little over 300 assets in 9 markets, but we do have 35 assets within the city of LA. So we are familiar with the different benchmarking requirements and audit requirements, and we're working on those as well. Today, and it sounds like the second half of the conversation, we're going to talk a little bit more about how we're looking at climate-related risks, climate change risks. My background was actually environmental compliance and due diligence. And so over time, I sort of crept into, as it became more important, to look at climate-related risks, managing that process as well at our company. So excited to be part of it.
Great, thank you. So I want to go back to Nancy because, of course, LADWP as the electric utility is a big part of the supply chain, right? And the reporting for everyone else. So could you talk a little bit about the scope and nature of DWP's commitment under SBTi?
Sure. So, yeah, we submitted our commitment letter in 2019 and our targets last year. So we're awaiting our validation from SBTi. But we really wanted to look across all of our all of the ways that we can think about science-based targets and make them consistent with what the city is trying to do overall. So you may be familiar with LA's Green New Deal, trying to decarbonize Los Angeles by 2050, and really looking at the kind of 5 zeros, 3 of which LADWP plays, well, actually 4 of which LADWP plays a really important role around a zero carbon grid, zero carbon buildings, zero carbon transportation, zero wasted water, and zero waste is not so much our charge. So we want to try to support those goals. We also completed last year a study with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, looking at what investments would be necessary for LADWP to get to 100% clean energy grid. And one of the things that study found was that we could do it by 2035. So that's our goal. So as we do all of that sort of grand planning around our infrastructure, we also really wanted to look at our own emissions, so not just the electricity we produce, also helping our customers who have goals of their own, so they understand how we are part of their supply chain, and then really looking at our own operations. As I said, we have a lot of buildings, we have a lot of vehicles, we have commuters, we have now more and more commuters now that we're coming back into the office. So we really tried to be comprehensive in our SBTi target and reach a 61% emission reduction target in comparison to our 2015 baseline. So a lot of work to do, but we're excited. And again, we want to hold ourselves accountable, but also show everybody in the city of Los Angeles that if we can do it, you can do it too. Thanks.
I love that the 61%. It's very precise, right? Very scientific.
Somebody did the math. Very scientific. That's right.
Indeed, indeed. Natalie, you guys have also been very scientific in your approach, and you made some decisions about what scopes of emissions to include versus not, and you spoke about the way that Hudson is organized in your business model. I wonder if you could speak about your science-based target in the context of the proposed SEC rules, and how you guys thought about this as you mentioned, a vertically integrated developer, owner, operator of buildings where you may or may not have a whole lot of operational control.
Yeah. Well, first, I want to say kudos to Nancy and all the work that DWP is doing, because as big, all of your customers like us are working on setting our own science-based targets. Understanding where our local utilities are heading and on what time frame is so important, because we've got to model out like what's the natural greening of the grid doing, what does that look like, projecting out to 2030, 2035. And then, what do we have to do on top of that, whether it's on-site renewables or other ways that we decarbonize. So anyway, it's so important, and doing that modeling is really hard. There's a lot of unknowns. In terms of our own kind of boundaries and scope for our own science-based target, this is where it gets really complicated. And the SEC guidance is awesome. It's a huge step forward. I think a lot of us in this space have been eager to see the SEC act on climate disclosure for a long time. But as a practitioner, it's really tricky to figure it out. And we're working with a bunch of our industry associations to engage with the SEC on this, because right now they're deferring to existing standards like Sbti is kind of the framework they refer to for all of the climate risk disclosure they're requiring, and the greenhouse gas protocol is the standard they're pointing to for the accounting for the quantitative aspect of the disclosure they're requiring. And when you dig into the greenhouse gas protocol, many of you on the line probably know there are different ways that are allowable under the protocol to set boundaries. And I know that many, I won't speak for multifamily, but like especially in commercial office, there are companies who look very similar who have very different boundaries, and it's all allowable as long as you're transparent about it and you show what methodology you use. For example, for us, we take a whole building approach. We include all of the emissions from our buildings, even the emissions that are in fully tenant controlled spaces in our scope 1 and 2. We own those. Those are part of our target, and they're part of what we'd be reporting in our 10K. The SEC, by the way, is also requiring scope 3 disclosure, at least in this current proposal, which is a whole other can of worms. But for us, our scope 1 and 2 numbers look a lot different than other companies who have similar portfolios, but may have drawn the boundaries different and excluded tenant spaces. And so when you think about what investors are looking for, and that's the problem that SEC is trying to solve for, is to get investors the data they've been clamoring for. It's useful to investors only when it's comparable and consistent. And that's why GAAP has been so important for financial accounting. And there's a bunch of non-GAAP measures that public companies use that are more appropriate to the business. And investors use those too, but without the GAAP framework, you can't get consistent data. And that's where the current SEC proposal and its reliance on the greenhouse gas protocol is going to get really tricky, because you're not going to get comparable and consistent data. And so that conversation, there's still a lot of work that has to be had around the weeds of the underlying methodology and what the SEC requires.
Yes. And my hope is that we don't get so caught up in all of the reporting that we don't have time, right, to develop and execute projects that are doing something about it. Because often it's the same people, right?
Yeah.
Looking at you guys that are dealing with all of that stuff, and then also supposed to be making a difference, right?
And I think that's a really important point as a lot of companies think about their org structure going forward. I mean, most companies have their accounting team is totally separate from the strategy team and the business units, right? Those are the ones figuring out how to, juice NOI, and not doing the GAAP accounting for the SEC, right? Like, those are different functions. And right now, I think a lot of sustainability teams wear both hats. And as the rules evolve, we're going to all have to think about how do we staff appropriately and find the right skill sets for both jobs.
And also, that's somewhere I don't want to forget about the sort of program side of this, which is, where we want to be, your partner on all of this. So, whether it's in, our energy efficiency incentive programs, which are really at all scales, from the smallest of businesses to the largest of buildings and campuses. We've worked with a lot of companies here in Los Angeles. Rebates for electric vehicle chargers. We've had a big focus on workplace charging as a way to get EV chargers deployed. So we're here to be your partner as you go down this journey of not just reporting your greenhouse gas emissions, but really focused on the programs to help you reduce them.
And how to help this all come together keeps me busy. It keeps me up at night. Becky,
and we're very grateful for that.
Yeah,
that's fun. I love this work. Becky, I wonder if you could just pick up on Natalie's point about, because I know you're part of a rock star team. If you could just talk about how you guys are set up. And then if you could expand a little bit more on the work that you specifically have been doing around climate risk assessments in the markets where you've looked at that. But first on the how you guys are set up, speaking to the accounting and trying to do everything all at once point, and then your piece within that.
No, that's a really good question. And Natalie, you brought up a really good point, because we were talking, Catherine Elliott's my colleague. She's our AVP that runs our sustainability program, and we sort of run parallel to each other on a lot of items and work very well together. And I know she was talking to our chief accounting officer yesterday about, the new finding and the new regulations that are coming down and how that's going to work, and that is a little bit more nuanced than typical accounting. So I know that that's something that they're thinking about. But we as a group, I think we have 6 or 7 people now on our sustainability energy resilience team, which is really exciting. And we have one person that is primarily dedicated to just reporting. I mean, there's a lot of reporting that goes on. And so between GRESB and CSA and Others that are even newer ones, TCFD, we have somebody focused on that. We have some analysts that sort of do the measure M&V work on projects that have been implemented. And then we have a like more technical people on our team as well that have a mechanical engineering background that are able to pilot and implement projects. So the regulations that LA is currently working on, the different building performance standards, we're already facing in our northeastern markets. And so we kind of know what's coming there, and we already are addressing them in the Northeast. And that's requiring a lot of auditing, understanding the gaps and where we need to get to, and then how to find those solutions and implement them. So it's a big team that all works together, and thankfully we're all in the same office in Chicago, so we can walk down the hall and talk to accounting as we start working through that side of things. So, and then on the climate risk assessment, switching gears over to that side, a few years ago, I guess maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we started hearing more and more about different cities and what they were doing to prepare for climate change. The resilience was the buzzword a couple of years ago. And as we were hearing more about that, we recognized that we needed to take some steps towards making sure we were protecting our physical assets. So really thinking it more as like a risk evaluation. And we started with doing some kind of market-specific climate risk reviews. We used a third-party consultant, Arup, which I know, Dave, you're working with them on a few projects right now. And they have a really strong resilience group. And we selected 2 markets where we did a deep dive into looking at the hazards that could potentially impact our assets based on location, and then also the building reviews. So it was not an on-site review, but we collected all sorts of information about our building to understand the building's vulnerability. And from that info, we started to understand more about the overall risks for the market, and then found opportunities with some of our buildings that we could take steps to further protect them going forward. And so we did that up in Boston, and then we did one in SoCal. So we have 35 assets in LA, but we have 60 in what we call our SoCal market. And it was really what we learned about SoCal. Some of you probably already know, but it was, some of the information is really interesting to us. And from that, we've already taken made some even small operational changes to further protect our assets from wildfire and other risks that were originally identified.
Can you share any examples, Becky? I'm curious.
Of steps that we're taking? Yeah, sure. I mean, some of the ones that were really small operational changes we can make are related to wildfire risk. And so we've changed the timing on when we do our gutter cleaning, for example. And this is not an additional cost. It's just a more thoughtful process of timing for when to do so. And so like those minor changes could make an impact. No one knows for sure, but we're hoping that they will. And we're looking at other things. We're doing some deep dive studies into some assets that are surprisingly showing up as flood risk in downtown LA. So we're trying to get our arms around why and what needs to be done about that.
Love to hear more about that on a future
Yes,
call. I'm realizing that the time is going very fast. There's no way we're going to get through all the questions that I had. But I wonder, I'll throw this one out. This one was not on our pre-populated list, but if any of the strategies that either of you are developing are leveraging utility programs, like Becky, I know you guys are doing a lot of solar, right? I mean, that's kind of a softball. Demand response is a newer one. I know, Nancy, that DWP has doubled its target for demand response participation this year. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. And Natalie and Becky, if you've looked at demand response or load shifting, energy storage, and the status of that very timely conversation.
Yeah, well, on demand response, I think consistent with the direction that we're heading, and the nature of the grid is changing, right? So we used to 25 years ago, there was a nuclear power plants and coal-fired power plants. They run all the time, and then you kind of only had to deal with the peaks. Now we have a different system, which is more reliant on renewable energy. And that just means we have to manage the grid differently. So anything that we can do to help manage the grid, so energy efficiency projects are super helpful, not just for our customers to save money, but also to help us manage peak loads, as well as demand response. So one thing that we found was actually one of our biggest participant in our demand response programs is LADWP's water system. So they can shift when they're pumping, as they move water around the city, to do that at a time where it's more advantageous for the grid. So even without affecting at all the operations, that we can do that. So I think the other thing is to take advantage of the technology that's now widely available to help manage and control load. And so things like, when you charge electric vehicles, what time of day, there's technology solutions for that as well. So we know that to meet our goals, we've got to kind of do everything that we can sort of on our side of the meter, but also help our customers help us on their side of the meter.
Right, and for example, or building on that, one of you mentioned more investment in workplace charging. It must have been Natalie. And there we're taking advantage of this abundance of solar, right? That's otherwise so much of it gets curtailed. And so if we can, install that in a way that makes sense, and we don't have people parking for 10 hours and hogging the spot. But that's the kind of conversations I hope that can come out of this, so that we have DWP and owners that want to be installing these types of projects really on the same page about this. But Natalie or Becky, do either of you have experience with demand response or load shifting programs within your portfolios?
We do, and interestingly, a lot of our learnings from that have been that the tactics we leaned on to take advantage of the demand response programs, then people essentially didn't notice when we dialed the lighting back or the HVAC or something. And so we've now just tried to make that standard operating procedure. Like, why would we only do that during peak times? Let's just do that all the time. So it's been a helpful way for us to essentially keep experimenting with what's possible in our operations, which is great. And so, yeah, love to see DWP scaling that program, not to mention all the other programs, which are awesome. And I know many of them are undergoing a review and overhaul right now, which is really exciting, whether it's the Green Power Program or the EV incentives, feed-in tariff, those are all really important for big users like us and for our tenants, I know, who are looking at those as well. And in many of our properties, we're collaborating with our tenants to figure out the right ways to take advantage of those programs.
And
yeah, I mean,
Becky,
sorry, I would just want to comment is just, we've tried to, on all of these programs, sort of take a portfolio approach. So that we really can address, our customers' needs, no matter where they are. So hopefully there's something for everyone in our portfolio programs. Thanks.
Absolutely. Becky, did you want to add to that? I forgot what I was going to ask you.
Were you going to ask me about demand response? So that's more on Catherine's side of the puzzle, but I know that we have piloted up in the Northeast. We've piloted a few different demand response programs, and we're in conversations right now to start rolling that out on the West Coast as well. We did have some challenges with the logistics of implementing the curtailment requirements. And so one of the things we're learning is it seems to work better in buildings that have BMSs and more automation. So we're learning, and we do hope to do more going forward.
I remember what the question was now, and that was the previous one, but the new one that popped into my head was, hearing from Nancy and Natalie about sort of the array of programs, the investments that DWP is making, How does all this factor into, as we look at climate risk and transition risk into your assessment? Because a huge piece of this, right, is physical asset risk, but then there's all the infrastructure that connects to that, right? And the city's ability to continue to support, right, the functionality of the buildings and everybody getting to and from those. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, so when we do these market specific reviews, in addition to learning about our assets, we really get a deep understanding from our consultants on the infrastructure risks in each market where we're looking at, and we'll be doing more of those this year. And some of the things, like we have assets now in Texas. We have an understanding that there's a little bit more grid instability at times down there. And so we are planning and figuring out how to ensure we have backup power. It's not always a thing at multifamilies. So we're looking at, in our capital plan, making sure that it will be, because this is a risk that is increasing over time. We are looking at, one of the other things is some of the risks that we're seeing are not at all asset specific. They're market wide, like in your market or in LA, we have drought. That doesn't vary by one asset to the other. And so that's kind of a big picture climate risk issue that not only we're looking at, but I think we're all looking at together and figuring out what the best way is as a community to address those risks.
Yeah, climate risk is an interesting one because it's such a big topic, and you could spend a ton of time on trying to quantify and understand every risk. And so I think you have to be really intentional about understanding yourself, why you're doing the assessment, what problems you're solving for. Is it to understand what operational procedures you can tweak, like the gutter cleaning example, like, oh, great, in which case more hyper local approach makes sense? Or is it to try to understand what's the total value at risk, so that you can communicate that to key investor groups who are looking for that information? In which case you probably want to take, for us, at least on that front, it's been less around physical risk and much more around transition risk. Questions like, what happens if New York local law 97 went into effect tomorrow across all of our markets? What's the total financial value at stake? Like running those scenarios to understand kind of the upper bounds of what's the worst case scenario for the business, not for the world. I think there's there's a bunch of different tools and ways to go about it. And so anyway, for anyone on the line who's looking at doing it, I would say just be really intentional about what question you're trying to solve with the exercise.
And I totally agree. We did a pretty deep dive into, there's a lot of climate risk data platforms out there. It seems like every day a new product comes out, and we spent a significant amount of time figuring out the one that was right for us. And I think it varies based on what your overall goals are and what your internal resources are and what they can do with that data. So like Natalie said, think about what you want to get out of it, because they're all shiny and exciting and they provide a lot of information, but you want to find the right one for your company.
Right, keeping that right balance so that you have enough time to actually implement projects and participate in the different programs. And on the drought, I know DWP just increased your cooling tower incentives. We're going after turf again, so just another plug for the investments that DWP is making. We're getting towards the end of the time, so I want to bring it back to the SEC proposed regulations and how we think about, right, what to include when we are investing our time in reporting, and what does sort of investment grade data look like, so that we're not can't be accused of greenwashing. Natalie, I know you've been following this real closely, so I'd kick that to you first, and then Nancy and Becky, feel free to jump in the last few minutes we have here.
Yeah, well, I mean, I kind of made that joke before, but like that it's good for the business, or what's good for the business necessarily isn't the same thing as what's good for the world. But that is kind of an important concept to dig into, because it's important to remember that the SEC regulations are really aimed at providing investors information about their financial risk, and therefore understanding, taking advantage of drought rebate programs, turf replacement programs is maybe a really good thing to do for the business, and it's important to do for LA as a region and our resilience to drought. But is that material to investors? Probably no, because at current water pricing, you have to understand what's the upper bounds of where water pricing is going to go in a severe drought, and is that material? And so you have to think about, you've got to focus on how climate related factors that when added up could be a material financial event for the company.
right? Which gets into a whole discussion on the price of water and rates and so forth. But
well, keeping with
Natalie,
the theme of water, since I mean we're a public agency, so you know we report a lot of things, but you know, even for our water system, for example, trying to understand sort of not just the climate risk associated with our water future, but how it relates to energy and the sort of embedded carbon and the embedded energy intensity and different ways that we can bring water to Los Angeles. So, you know, there is, you know, we've seen certainly, I think, you know, real impacts of climate change on our water supplies. And in response, I think we really have to think about that embedded energy and the embedded carbon in our water supply. And it's something that we've done for a number of years and are also we're one of the first reporters in the Climate Registry's Water Energy Nexus. So back to reporting.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're saving one, you're saving the other, and then of course, you know, if we don't have a reliable water supply, we're in big trouble operationally. And how does this all translate into other risks? Can we cool our buildings, right? And looking at more creative ways to reuse water, and how does that get impacted by climate? You know, we've been helping to develop some groundwater recapture reuse projects, and the groundwater table can change, right? That happened midstream on a project we were developing, where the flow rates just decreased to a point where the project was uneconomic, and that was surprising. So these things can happen. It's all really moving in real time. But I want to just make sure we hit on the point of, you know, within this reporting, you know, heavy, you know, topic today, Natalie, if you could talk about, you know, Hudson's decisions about what to include in your reporting, and how, by contrast, it might be more difficult for a residential owner like Becky's firm. And I know, Becky, this is not your specific area, so I'm not putting you on the spot with that. I just want to make sure I give Natalie a chance to speak about that, because I was really impressed with your approach.
Sure. Well, yeah. So as I mentioned, we take a whole building approach, and we include emissions from the whole building, which including tenant controlled spaces, which feels like to us like the right thing to do, because even when it's a tenant controlled space, like we still own the building, we're still controlling long-term capital planning and expenses in the building. And so the overall efficiency of the HVAC system, for example, is in our hands, not the tenant's hands, even though we have no control over how many computers they decide to plug in and how efficient those computers are. But also it's easier for us because we have benchmarking ordinances in all of our jurisdictions. And so we have whole building data for the most part. We only have a handful of places where we rely on tenants to send us their bills. It's totally different for Becky's business, where getting that information is probably impossible if in a lot of your markets. Yeah.
Yeah, and another plug for DWP, you know, in prep for the existing buildings efficiency ordinance, which has now been on the books for 5 or so years, they developed the capability to aggregate and provide that whole building data, even for multifamily properties. So, you know, that's a huge get for everybody. I remember in the early days, you know, the Department of Energy was hounding me every reporting period. Dave, why can't you get the whole building data? I'm like, nobody has that, right? So until we had the policy there wasn't the urgency, right? Because you have to have a use for the data, as I think has been said many, many times here today. So we are at time. So I really want to thank all of you for tuning in today, and really thank you to our panelists. We could go on and on. You guys have been doing so much cool stuff and know so much. So thank you all again, and please look out for the recap. We got a bunch of great resources coming through, and please reach out. Please reach out. We want to keep growing this thing. LA's best buildings want to hear from you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
Bye.